Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm in the hot seat again for part 3 of New Zion. How do we get there? Off to you, Tim.
All right, so this will be part 3 here. How do we get there? So it seems to me there's roughly 2 ways in general we could get there. I want to just quickly add a short framework of how I think 2 possible ways we get there. I'd say there's the good or positive way, which is society just keeps getting wealthier and wealthier, and then we end up in this sort of materialistic, nihilistic, decadent society. Or there's the sort of bad way, which is some kind of holocaust of some sort, or genocide, or some sort of gulag type approach where Christians just get slaughtered of some variety, and we have a kind of exodus to New Zion. So first of all, would you agree with this framework? There seems to be 2 ways. And second, what would be the good way to get to New Zion for you?
I would agree that those are both, how shall we say, sets. If you imagine a movie, these would be the sets on which the movie takes place. One of those two. But that's a little meta. It's more like under what conditions. I mean, obviously there's a violent persecution, which, I mean, the state of Israel was born in violent persecution, so that can happen. Or it could be relatively peaceful, where, you just, I guess, sort of like create the Mormon state after the U.S. Civil War. It's like, no one's really invading Utah anymore, and you just kind of consolidate your gains.
So what would be the bad way then, that you'd presume? And do you think this sort of bad scenario is a likely scenario? I have to think that to a certain extent, that in current United States, to some extent, and more so in places like Western Europe, that Christians of your variety are persecuted to some degrees. And then we see this in a more explicit, further east we go, especially in places like China, Syria, and so forth, depending on your definition of Christian. But I think you can see a general movement towards some variety of persecution in the United States. I think it's a fairly mild version still. But I definitely think that there is some sort of growing persecution movement. And I think you would agree with that. And do you view this as a solution?
Well, I think both options, increasing hedonism and persecution, are bad. So maybe it's like less bad versus more bad. Would you rather, basically? Increasing hedonism, at least we're not being killed. So I guess that's less bad than some sort of violent persecution. But then it's a double-edged sword, because when Christians are persecuted, as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seat of the church. Whereas increasing hedonism makes everybody complacent. So while it might look like hedonism is the least bad option, it might not actually be. It might be better to have a violent persecution to galvanize the faithful. So it's not such an easy cut and dry answer.
In the last episode, we went through societies that to a certain extent are roughly historical antecedents. We listed them: Israel, we listed Singapore, Utah, we listed Puritan North America. In most cases, especially in Puritan North America and Israel, they were founded by indirect or direct persecution. Do you think the persecution route would be the way? Under what circumstances do you think a kind of persecution would come about?
Well, we've had increasingly anti-Christian rhetoric from the media, from the educational system, and from the government since the 90s. Really, once the threat of international atheist, global suicide and a nuclear holocaust disappeared, then I think the sort of mask slipped, and the corporate industry, which had up to that point, pretended to be friends with Christians, said, well, we're not friends anymore, because now that the communist threat's gone, the atheist threat's gone, we can, you stand in the way of us maximizing profit. And so, yeah, I mean, the left is fond of saying that rhetoric is violence, and that, we have to suppress racist rhetoric because it could lead to violence against minorities. Well, okay, a lot of this anti-Christian blood libel leads to violence. We saw it in Russia and Turkey and Sudan and Eastern Europe and North Korea. Yeah, and it's not just hypothetical, like the left being hypothetical that this right-wing rhetoric would lead to a murderous backlash against immigrants. We have historical examples of Christians being killed with this rhetoric. The new atheist rhetoric is similar to the Soviet League of the Militant Godless rhetoric, and we saw where that got us. So I think in all likelihood, it would be sort of just the general corporate socialist alliance that, more and more forms of sexual identification are accepted, which of course Christianity would reject, as well as consumerism and all these alternative lifestyles. And because they'll say that we're bigoted or this or that, that won't be the real reason. The real reason is because Christians stand in the way of the state and the almighty dollar. And the way they rationalize to get the mob fired up is to say that we're prejudiced.
Well, Christianity. So, if we get to New Zion, what do you think would be the time frame that New Zion will be formed? Would this be in the next 50 years, in the 100 years, or is this a purely fictional society in your mind? I'm not trying to ask this in a flippant way. I'm asking this to a certain extent. I'm genuinely curious because people were talking about the sort of Israeli settlement, and from day one, Mormons to a certain extent, Joseph Smith and et al. Were talking about going out and doing this. So what would be the time frame that you think this would occur?
Well, that's kind of the thing. These sort of new states, these new communities are purely fictional and mental until they're not. There are all these Jews talking about the need for a state for Israel, and it was just purely fictional and seemed almost impossible to achieve until it happened. And the same would go for the Mormons in Utah. I mean, they started off in New York State. Having their own Mormon community free from oppression seemed impossible until it wasn't. And so all these groups start with, there's a gestation period before birth where there's the idea space that's being taken. I mean, even Noam Chomsky admits this about Barcelona. That 3 years of Barcelona was really the iceberg tip of 30 or 40 years of labor union organizing. So, the gestation period might be 30 to 40 years before we're ready to give birth to New Zion. So, I guess that would be my answer.
Now, as far as geography is concerned, when we asked, when you had the similar episode with Keith, you asked where it would be, to a certain extent, where it would be located. Where would be some possible locations you would think New Zion would take place? Would it be inside of the United States after some sort of collapse? A lot of people, from Hans Hoppe to Rothbard, think the United States is going to collapse to some degree. Would it be someplace in Western Europe? Would it be someplace in Asia? What would be if you could, and predictions are tricky things about the future, but what would be your geographic location if we're talking about how to get there?
I think somewhere either in Western Europe or North America would be my first guess. I mean, you could always have an expatriate community, sort of like, the Afrikaners in Orania, but that leads to a lot of risks because eventually the ANC is going to clamp down on Orania. What they'll probably justify it as is the economic prosperity that it produces is not going to the black population, and they'll say it's being stolen, and just like socialism every decade, they'll just kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So that's a bit dangerous. Preferably North America or Western Europe, preferably an island or mountainous forested regions, areas that are like Switzerland, mountainous, or an island like the UK or North America, which is essentially a continental island. It's very difficult to invade North America. Rugged terrain is good for two things. It makes it difficult to centralize power because the people that live there are sort of dispersed, and it's hard to marshal them to consolidate control, and also it's harder to invade. And the same would also hold for forests, jungles, and swamps. So like Vietnam repelled Mongol invasion after Mongol invasion because it's just really hard to get around there. So somewhere in North America, Western Europe, somewhere mountainous or forested.
Um, is is there any biblical precedence to this? I mean, to a certain extent, I already know the answer to this question, but I would sort of like to explain this because I think there is biblical precedent in this to the community you're talking about. And if so, could you explain?
Yeah. So first of all, we think of Palestine as flat, and there are parts of Palestine that are. But modern day Israel, like ancient Palestine, is sort of cut into horizontally, or rather vertically, by a mountain range. And to the west of that mountain range is the Mediterranean Valley, and to the east opens up to the deserts of Arabia. And so what would usually happen with ancient Israel is they could retreat to these mountainous terrain where the chariot armies of the Canaanites and the Philistines would fumble, and they could then use their maneuverability to an advantage to defeat them. Furthermore, the mountainous terrain made it undesirable, though that was counterbalanced by the trade routes. So the trade routes going the King's Road from Egypt to Persia went right through Palestine. So despite the fact that it was mountainous and difficult to occupy, as the Seleucids figured out, they still tried because it was profitable enough to try. Obviously, picking up and leaving. Well, I'll just post this statement by the commenter Olaf Anderson, the Book of Acts and Exodus. So in this context, people leave from persecution to create a new life for themselves. And so now in the case of Acts, they don't have any particular one location they're going to. It could be, anywhere. I'm just thinking of terms of defensibility or sort of obscurity, so people wouldn't go out of their way to mess with you.
Not to go too quickly into sort of theological matters, but would this be some sort of post-millennial, pre-millennial? Where does this fit in your view? Because to a certain extent, the United States was founded. Now, different groups had different theories behind their finding, but there was a kind of New World mentality. So do you think that your community, and especially with Israel and Utah, those two cases, to a certain extent, it's written in the book, so to speak, Book of Mormon, and so forth, that these communities, promised land, will get founded. Do you see any appeals to that kind of argumentation?
Well, I mean, I don't think any particular kind of eschatology is necessarily a requirement. A lot of people might think, especially with the Puritan Afrikaner context, that post-millennialism would be a sort of popular choice, and that might well be. But I don't necessarily think the Quakers and the Anabaptists that settled in Pennsylvania were post-millennial. I think they were probably more amillennial in orientation. And premillennialism at the time of the American founding was really a kind of a lost art. It wasn't until the early 19th century that premillennialism makes a comeback. So as to how popular I mean, in the United States, it's incredibly popular. So I think just by default, a lot of people would be premillennial anyhow.
We see with Oliver Cromwell's model army, we talked about this a little bit last week, as to a certain extent creating a new society. Now, whether or not he did or did not is some question, and whether or not people are in favor of that or not in favor of that is some question. But in order to get this society, would there be required an army to a certain extent to secure the territory, so to speak? And who would be doing this in this new society? I mean, with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, you had a pretty explicit military force under, Napoleon later, but in the early revolutionary days, you still had an army. And then, of course, the American Revolution had Washington, the Continental Army, and other characters as well. So to a certain extent, you need some kind of military force. Now, it could be a purely breakaway community, some post-apocalyptic thing. But if we assume that there are some hostile threats around, you're going to need some kind of army. Who would do the army, and how would this be organized?
Well, I think basically there's sort of two models to New Zion that we've talked about before. One is a more shall we say, stricter and world-denying version, which would not rely on military force, which we saw with the Quakers, well, sort of, in Pennsylvania, and then the Anabaptists had settled there. But then there's also another kind of New Zion, which is more millennial in its expectations and more willing to be violent. And in a lot of regards, that's what the United States was in its colonial phase. And one was within the other. Think of like a Russian doll, where like, there's a smaller doll inside the larger doll. So the larger doll would be the more militant New Zion, and the smaller doll might be the more peaceful one that exists inside of it. The one that exists, the larger doll, that's the more militant one, would probably have to have some sort of military force. And to the extent that I want to get into it here, it's essentially a combination of Starship Troopers. You don't vote if you don't defend the nation, but also volunteer, because I agree with Deuteronomy chapter 20, which of course Heinlein was familiar with because he cites it as a chapter heading in. Well, he doesn't cite that. He actually cites Judges chapter 7 with the story of Gideon, which deals with the application of that principle in Starship Troopers. So we do want to respect. Basically, the idea is, with the new model army, as the example we mentioned, we only want the best, the most motivated, and the most elite. And does that mean you're going to be outnumbered? Sure. But in Cromwell's case, it didn't really matter much because he crushed everyone that went up against him. Assuming parity with technology, he didn't need a massive disparity in technology the way the conquistadors did. So in that regard, it would be a combination of, a more explicitly Starship Troopers, because of course Heinlein isn't a Christian and doesn't really accept the broader implications of appealing to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and Judges chapter 7. And then also the smaller doll inside the larger one could exist on its own, as we saw in Russia with the German Mennonites who made a deal with the Tsar that they could practice effectively. Though, as we see historically, most Mennonites and Anabaptists fled Europe to North America, Canada, and the United States. So New Zion is like the Russian doll. The bigger doll is the more militant, probably post-millennial. And then the sort of inner doll is a more peaceful premillennial.
For the sort of larger doll, New Zion, what kind of groups were you thinking would be the sort of breakaway groups that would start this in the larger doll? I mean, in the smaller doll, it's quite clear it'd be the Amish and Mennonites of Trumbury. But in the larger doll, who would make up those groups?
I could see a lot of Reformed people doing it. They tend to be the best at it anyhow. Whether it's Puritan New England, Cromwell's Puritanism, the Afrikaners, probably Reformed, to be honest. Maybe Lutherans. Obviously, Gustavus Adolphus in Prussia had quite a ferocious reputation. And oddly enough, the Lutherans, because of the formation of the Evangelical Union with the early 19th century by the Prussian Kaiser, caused many to flee to Europe because they didn't want to change, or to the United States, because they didn't want to join the new state church because it felt like they had to compromise on their principles. And in the United States, at least, Lutherans tend to be anti-statist rather than statist. So I can envision Lutherans doing that as well. Maybe not the more statist Lutherans of old Europe, but the North American Lutherans, which are more skeptical of state power. I think them and Reformed.
If we get to this point, what would be the organization structure for all these groups to get along? We see with the Reformation that it's not clear that all Protestants get along to a certain extent. Now they do eventually start getting along more so, but what would be the governing structure for all these different groups to get along if we get into a sort of post-collapse type environment where we have the need to start a society like that?
Well, yeah, I've sort of thought about this in other contexts, but the way I'd look at it is this. I'm going to take a page from Mussolini. Mussolini, in his Doctrine of Fascism, talks about how he envisions trades organizing around their trade and then having a sort of council of leaders, the sort of syndicates, because Mussolini was a syndicalist, would then represent them, their entire profession, to the state and to other bodies. And so for each denomination or family of denominations, they would have essentially a council that would represent them to the other councils of denominations and to, I mean, we already see things kind of like this now with like the Mennonite Central Committee and the Southern Baptist SBC. So we'll have something like that. Now, also the idea, it would be, again, to take a page this time from the anarcho-syndicalists, horizontal federations. So something like horizontal federations between these different religious bodies.
For the again, back to the larger doll, I like this distinction you have between larger and the smaller doll. Would the larger doll be capital S in the sort of libertarian parlance, statist of some variety? Would it be a statist army, so to speak? Would it be a statist economic system? Would it be very similar to the United States, just with a different crop of people, or maybe the same crop of people we had in the 1890s? What would be the makeup of the larger doll?
Well, again, this is where it gets a little interesting, because the late Murray Bookchin, in his final interview, points out that as an anarchist, he drew inspiration from Puritan New England and ancient Athens, neither of which he considered states, by the way. Now, I think modern-day anarchists would call them states, and in some sense, that's why Bookchin is not quite as popular as he used to be. And I think Rothbard would object as well to that. But I think what is the state? That is part of the question, because even if an anarchist like Bookchin could say that Athens and New England were not states, well, I mean, I don't know. But to answer the question, probably minarchist. Probably a lowercase L libertarian like Switzerland, the early 13 colonies. Again, Anglo-Saxon England before 1066. The Greek city-states with a little more cohesion. Those would sort of be the level of centralization that I'm talking about.
There wouldn't be any monarchs, correct?
No, no.
Sorry, I had to ask that question. So if Plymouth and Bookchin, yes, didn't call them states. If those societies weren't states, would New Zion have a capital? If we're assuming the sort of large doll version of New Zion, would it have a state? And just as a historical curiosity, when do you think the American state began? If Plymouth didn't have a state, it was a sort of Plymouth, the Puritan community in Plymouth was not a state society. When do you think the state was imposed then? And then when would the state then be imposed in New Zion?
Well, I think most libertarians and anarchists would agree that whatever existed, something like a state could certainly be said to exist in 1787 with the drafting of the Constitution. The outer doll would be like, yeah, okay, maybe the level of 1787, somewhere on the spectrum between the United States at 1787 and 1860, because obviously Lincoln ramps up the size of the federal government. Within a range, anything the size of the U.S. government prior to Abraham Lincoln.
Ideally, how would you hope your society comes about? I sort of opened up with the sort of two scenarios that you could movie type scenarios. Ideally, what would be your ideal situation for New Zion to come out?
Well, I would say ideally, we avoid lots of persecution and bloodshed, and that people realize that hedonism is an empty lifestyle, and that they want some more meaning in their life. And we do begin to see little bits of it here and there now, where people are taking what would be perceived as extreme positions, extreme lifestyles, because it gives them meaning, it gives them more satisfaction. And that would be what I would hope would be the way it happens. But I'm not entirely sure we can avoid persecution.
Would New Zion be mostly intentionally founded people to begin with in that regard, in the same way that Israel and uh, uh, Mormon Utah were mostly intentionally founded people? There's a high commit cost to starting a society like that. I would assume the first generation would be probably a very crusty bunch. Even if you imagine if it's a very large society, I still think it would be the first generation would probably have to be extremely committed and extremely engaged in this expedition, so to speak.
Yes, exactly. Something very much like the founding of the modern nation state of Israel or Mormon Utah or even Puritan New England. All these three groups have a lot of similarities in the intentionality of it. Um, Before we get to your question, a good question was asked by Olaf Anderson, which I'll post to the screen here. He says, what is the protocol for converts who wish to immigrate to New Zion? Public confession? Well, in I think in the first episode, I mentioned that only Protestants would be considered. And then if you met that criteria, then we'd prioritize Northwest Europeans and their expatriate kin, and then Semites and East Asians, but not to the point that would upset the 70% supermajority of Northwest Europeans. So you can go ahead and ask your question now.
Let me think. What was the question? Sorry, lost my train of. The first, sorry, my microphone got lost there. Would the first generation be a? I would assume the first generation would be a very hardy bunch. It would probably be the main driving force behind it. Who do you think would make up this for the first foundation stone, so to speak, in your society?
Well, I think, to be honest, most of these people would be Zoomers. I think Boomers are pretty much a lost cause. Millennials are a mixed bag. And see, the reason why I think it would be Zoomers is because we're talking about this sort of dissatisfaction with the current system. Boomers and Millennials, to an extent, have made it work. They've earned their cut of the cake or slice of the pie. And it's bad, but it's good enough. Zoomers don't have any prospects, really. They see all the negatives of modern society without any of the benefits. I think, in all likelihood, the age demographic is going to be Zoomers primarily. I think probably when it comes to the actual maybe class status, based on the rigorous selection I would want, it would tend to be high IQ, people just like in Puritan New England. They wanted artisans, craftsmen, people that were they worked smart rather than worked hard. I mean, obviously you would be working hard, but if you're highly intelligent and you use, new techniques of construction and farming and whatnot, you're working smarter, so you do more for less. And so basically a higher IQ. So we're talking like white collar, probably white collar Zoomers. I'd like to start with.
And for those people who don't know what the Zoomers are, what age bracket are the Zoomers, and what are the sort of class defining characteristics of the Zoomers?
So the Zoomers are they're basically born after 1966, and that's the most recent generational classification. And it's just after 1966. There probably won't be that many white collar Zoomers, unfortunately, because the job opportunities are not that good. But at least they'd be white collar competent if they had been offered the job. And this is where we probably have to have some millennials and boomers, because they would have that knowledge, that specialized professional knowledge. And so I guess in that regard, that's where the millennial and boomer element would come from.
Early on, you talked about horizontal federations. What would be the international relations, so to speak, of a small New Zion starting out? We see with Israel, Israel basically had to win its first three wars, or each of its first three wars. It was lost. It was game over. So let's just imagine that you get a small city state, let's say in southern Texas, or between Canada and the United States, some place like that. an island out in the Pacific. What would be the international relations, so to speak, of the early New Zion? Once, let's say you establish a small state and so forth. Because even we see with places like Plymouth, they had to face attacks from the French. They had to take attacks from they had to face the Mother Nature as well, and also the Indians as well. So they had three threats. And then states like the Mormons, they were friends. And then of course Israel, of course, as it went through 48 and the 6 Day War. If they lost, it's game over. So early on, what would be the international relations of a small city-state type New Zion?
Well, I think for the same reasons the United States pursued such a policy for about 100 years, a policy of non-intervention, because obviously we're small, and anybody that really did want to wipe us out probably could have or could. Israel's position was a little different than the United States because the Arabs both had the will and the means to attempt to wipe Israel out. Nobody really had the will to wipe out the 13 colonies, even if some of the great powers had the means. So that's a bit of a somewhat different category. And I think what I would like to see is a foreign policy where, one, we produce certain strategic resources that make us indispensable. Why doesn't China invade Taiwan? Well, I mean, obviously there's the U.S. fleet there, but also Taiwan is a leading producer of semiconductors and circuits. Same with South Korea. I mean, if you invaded South Korea and Taiwan, you'd probably collapse the global economy. That level of indispensability would be quite useful. Also, maybe the Swiss model. We store all your money, so everybody agrees not to invade us because nobody wants to put their savings at risk. So we could see, depending on the circumstances, a Swiss model where we just sort of mind our own business and store something of value that other nations have or want, and then by mutual consent they leave us alone. We might also produce something that's indispensable for the global economy, such that if anybody invades us, the global economy would collapse, and then the great powers would be like, well, we may not agree with New Zion on everything, but we don't really want to see the global economy collapse either. And then thirdly, sort of a campaign of building goodwill with other nations. So hypothetically, in the same way that before the War on Terror, the United States had a lot of goodwill with other nations because of humanitarian efforts it had done, it kind of burned a lot of that goodwill away with the War on Terror and unilateral military interventions, which is understandable. But that was actually a policy of the Founding Fathers, right? The city on a hill, be sort of light to the world and build goodwill with all the nations. And it largely worked. The pressures that shifted the United States from an isolationist power to an interventionist power were not really external pressures of threat of enemy invasion or conquest. It was really sort of to expand access to markets. So it was an internal pressure due to the development of capitalism. And we've sort of already dealt with how I would deal with economic centralization.
So you seem to buy the sort of classic line about American history. It's not classic, but more Ron Pauline type view of foreign policy. What would be ways that what would ways that New Zion wouldn't go down this road? Now, this might go into our next episode to a certain extent, so if you don't want to answer it, that's fine. But what would be some ways that New Zion's foreign policy wouldn't do this?
Well, okay, first of all, John Quincy Adams' speech against crusading for liberty and seeking dragons to slay would be enshrined in a plaque in the Capitol building. So that's how seriously we would think about these foreign interventions. Now, again, in this regard, I would dissent slightly from the Ron Paul narrative. The United States was never truly non-interventionist. I mean, we sent in the 1870s, we sent expeditionary force to Korea to open it up. We did gunboat diplomacy with Japan. We had Marines go to Sumatra to fight pirates. We had Marines go to North Africa to fight pirates. But those are qualitatively different than, say, World War One, the Korean War, the Iraq War, where there's a massive national buildup to deploy troops abroad for political objectives. In that regard, I'm not saying New Zealand would never do that, the outer doll of the shell, but I'm also saying that that would be something of last resort.
And now my sort of moving to another line of questioning. Alliances. I'm talking about alliances on two levels. I'm talking about alliances on the local level, and I'm talking about alliances on the more national level. As far as groups are concerned, one of the questions I sometimes ask you is such and such person allowed to enter New Zion? And you oftentimes say yes or no. It depends. Um, but what groups of atheists, for example, will be allowed in New Zion, concluding that they did not hit to the seven? You have some sort of super majority. What groups of atheists would you be willing to allow into this group?
The only group of atheists that would be allowed in New Zion would be those that were through indigenous defection that didn't get their property rights confiscated by being degenerate.
So you wouldn't have any interest in making alliances early on, imagining some sort of apocalyptic scenario.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Not so much migrants, but like doing business with them and allowing them to have diplomatic centers in New Zion. Is that your question?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, but I'll get to my question. You can answer that question first.
Well, yeah. I mean, if there happened to be like, say, the Republic of Rand, I don't know, and it was a bunch of objectivists. I mean, yeah, we would have diplomatic relations with them, and if that meant they'd have to have, a diplomatic staff in our country, sure. Those are those edge cases, right? We're not dealing with immigrants per se. We're dealing with representatives of a state or a state-like entity. So in that regard, I think in general, New Zion's foreign policy would be to be on at least, if not friendly, at least neutral terms with anti-authoritarian movements. Because in the long run, whatever our disagreements might be, anti-authoritarian movements are going to lack the strength to crush us. But basically, and then also for those larger nations, I mean, something like the Soviet Union, no, there just won't be any diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union. I mean, we have to have some standards. Or if the ANCOMs, get trigger happy and start shooting up Christians like they're prone to do, punitive measures might be necessary. But assuming the ANCOMs behave themselves, they in the Randroids behave themselves, they could have diplomatic representation. Communists, the state communist North Korea, China, Russia, no.
But the sort of spirit of my question was asking was early on. The question I asked in the previous podcast to an anarcho-syndicalist was, why do anarcho-syndicalists always make deals with communists and lose? And to a certain extent, I'm asking this question. With the American Revolution, we have two groups, I'd say, the sort of secular Jacobins and the more conservative, anti-monarchical Puritans of some variety. I think you would largely agree with that simplified framework. Would there be any deals made with more, I don't know if you could call them atheist libertarians, you could call them right-wing anarchists, and so forth. Let's say, and I imagine some sort of, fallout, which you talked about with Keith Preston on his pan-anarchism. But would you be willing to make any deals with this, or would you want to keep this very pure?
Well, generally speaking, the purer the better. So I would not necessarily go out of my way to be their friends, but I wouldn't also necessarily go out of the way to attack them and be their enemy. And certainly, let's say in this post-apocalyptic scenario, the tankies invade. Well, okay, objectivists don't look that bad compared to tankies. And at that point, it's, we all hang together, or we all hang separately, to quote Ben Franklin. So if it happened, it would be more out of necessity, not out of choice.
But you don't foresee any large body of atheists in your society, or any in that respect, except homegrown indigenous, which we'll discuss more in the next episode. You see this
Yeah,
as
that would be it.
primarily as a intentional Christian community. Um,
So the only atheists that would be allowed in New Zion would be, I could envision three categories: representatives of foreign states, like the Republic of Rand, or state-like entities, like in Kapistan, sure. Homegrown defectors that don't forfeit their property rights by being degenerate, and then third, and this is where it gets a little muddy because Kapistan falls into this category as well. International corporations that don't really discriminate on who they hire. Because, of course, if we're going to give a startup to produce resources that the global economy needs, we'll have to some extent learn the skills from already existing corporations. We might even need to charter them to build these things. In which case, okay, sure. I mean, my argument is, even David had Philistines in his army. They were mercenaries. And as long as they, played by the rules of Israel, that was more or less okay.
Would any of these groups undermine the sort of dominant ethos, or would they strengthen the ethos? And do you see this problem? Do you think this was one of the problems that happened to the United States? Because I think you're largely correct. Dallas Willard, I was recently reading a book about Dallas Willard as well. He said 1870s to 1900s, like all the major universities in the United States are founded by religious fundamentalists, all the big ones, until you get the land-grant institutions. But, all the Harvard, Princeton, they're all founded by reformist people, Quakers, what have you. So I largely agree with your historiography. So do you think that the United States was, to a certain extent, poisoned by selling out and compromising, or I'm trying to avoid the questions we'll get to our next episode, but sort of in the early gestation period, will you have to keep a very low tolerance of atheists, I would assume?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea would be, obviously, you can't shut out the world. See, there's kind of a balancing act, right? The balancing act is how much of the world do you let in, how much of the world do you shut out. You can't completely shut it out because then you're North Korea, and then you can't completely throw open all the borders. Otherwise, you're, modern day West. It's a balancing act, and I tend to favor balancing it in favor of shutting things out. Now, in the regards of allowing technical personnel from global corporations and NGOs that may be atheists, well, I think they will strengthen the country if we can learn what they have to teach us as rapidly as possible and leverage their financial assets as rapidly as possible to then not need them anymore. Think of it like an investment loan. You take out a loan to start a business, and then that business is profitable and you pay back the loan. Now, if the business is not profitable, then the loan could sink you and you'd be in no trouble. So that's kind of how we view these folks when it comes to foreign states or state-like actors. Yeah, that could be a threat, but it also depends on the conditions under which this takes place. I mean, if it's like life and death, the tankies are invading, well, there are some things worse than making a deal with the Republic of Rand. But the other thing is, again, we wouldn't go out of our way to do that. It would be, and also the strategy that England and later the United States followed was to be a sort of net lender, a creditor. So, people owe us, and therefore, people are less inclined to attack us and more willing to be nice, because if we call in the debts, then they're going to be in trouble, because as the good book says, the lender is a slave, the debtor is a slave to the lender. So yeah, we want to be the lender in this position.
Well, I know this is shorter than the longer episodes, but unless you have any more things to add, because I don't really want to get into the how do we keep it, which will be our next episode. But unless you have any other comments or possible points you want to make, I'm basically finished with my questions here.
I think a few points that need to be brought out is, okay, how do we start from the idea to, let's say, New Zion, Utah? Basically, that's still within the United States. The United States hasn't collapsed yet, but we own a state. It's ours, and now we run it the way we want to. Uh, First step, acknowledge the problem as an individual. Second step, in your own life, seek to uh, improve. Well, self improvement's lame. Conform yourself to the image of Christ in the gospel. And once enough of us start to do that, because the problem with the New Zion is we don't have, like even Keith Preston says it's about pan-anarchism. The right kind of people don't exist yet. They're too soft. They're too selfish. So he's got, many people are in the same problem, but this is where I think we have an edge by conforming to the likeness of Christ in the Gospels. We're able to create people that are selfless and willing to work in a group for the sake of a common goal, to a degree that anarchists, libertarians, and ethnats can't really do. Ethnats maybe a little closer with Blood and Soil, but even then I think it's somewhat dubious. And then the next step is, once you get enough of these people, you have big families. Demographics is destiny. The fundies are going to win because we have all the kids, as Eric Kaufman says. So continue that strategy. And then once you get enough of those, you start building voluntary fraternal organizations that are explicitly religious. So if you want to limit it based on sex, or which, you could say, well, you're violating my religious freedom. And we could use that as a shield so the feminists don't knock down the male fraternities and say, oh, that's just sexist. Well, no, it's a pastors association, whatever, elders association. It'd be a violation of the First Amendment. So then we start building that up. And then we basically just, like Keith Preston said in his Pan-Anarchism series, we just, do state services better than the state. The wobbly strategy, build the new society in the shell of the old. So once we have committed families that have these bonds of working together, being organized in fraternal organizations, we have enough money saved up, then we go out somewhere where land is either cheap or defensible or whatever, and then we just buy it up. And then we start the exodus. Once the first group is there, that's really, once we have land, that's when it really starts. Then we can start, saying we buy up more land till hopefully we own the whole state. And then we're like, okay, well, you can come in, you can't. And eventually through endogenous growth through children and exogenous growth through converts and like-minded people, we can hopefully achieve a kind of Mormon level success. That's highly condensed, and maybe you have some questions about that, but that's sort of the TLDR from an idea to Utah.
Yeah, I remember the episode with Keith that you did when he said that the right type of people don't exist. And what would be some strategies you think you can cultivate to get the right type of people? Because I think there's a handful of people that are committed, and one of the ways to get people committed is to have some state persecution. But what would be strategies outside of that to get people more committed to your community?
Well, I think in the ways that public debate and workers' councils was sort of the centerpiece of the Russian Revolution, Bible studies would be the centerpiece of the New Zion Revolution, where people from local communities and individuals would get together on a ideally daily basis to study the Bible, to build up a community of like-minded people, a fellowship. And of course, there's going to be a lot of give and take, kind of like a debate. I mean, after all, a lot of America's greatest orators, even in the 20th century, were pastors, because oration was just essential to church life. So we would also have pastors, learn rhetoric so that they could better communicate their message to the people. So we'd have a kind of lay movement based on Bible study and give and take, and then a more leadership-oriented movement based around speaking skills and rhetoric, where the pastors become, we saw this in the civil rights movement. Many of the most well-articulated black spokesmen for civil rights were themselves pastors. And so I think that would be really, and then of course also mutual aid. And, well, it's not what it used to be. Mutual aid used to be done by the church. And so mutual aid organizations in the church, Bible studies and sort of pastors' associations where they learn rhetoric. And these three sort of fellowships would, I think, be the pillars of creating the kind of people that New Zion would need.
Well, great. Well, that's basically ends my line of questioning here. Next week we'll do the more involved one of how do we keep it, which I think is much more difficult. But yes, thanks for doing this. Back to you.
Thank you, Tim. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.